I thought the man walking toward me was the last mistake I would ever make. The pavement was cold against my cheek, the kind of cold that seeps through your skin and settles somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to reach, and for a second I focused on that instead of everything else, instead of the ringing in my ears, instead of the way my breath came in uneven pulls like my lungs had forgotten their rhythm, instead of the distant echo of footsteps that didn't belong to the ones who had just left me there. Because those footsteps were slower, measured, deliberate, like whoever they belonged to had nowhere else to be and nothing to fear, and that alone should have terrified me more than anything, but I was too tired to be afraid the way I should have been, too worn down to do anything except lie there and listen as the sound grew closer, sharp against the quiet hum of the city at night, until I saw the shadow fall across the dim streetlight and I knew someone was standing over me, watching, assessing, deciding. And I didn't move, didn't speak, because instinct told me that whatever came next would depend on silence, on stillness, on not drawing attention to the fact that I was still conscious, still aware, still here, and for a moment nothing happened, just the faint sound of fabric shifting, the subtle creak of leather, the kind of details you only notice when everything else fades into the background, and then a voice cut through the stillness, low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed. Who did this? And it wasn't asked like a question, not really, it was more like a statement waiting for confirmation, and I felt something tighten in my chest because I didn't have an answer I was willing to give, not to a stranger, not to someone who sounded like that, like he was used to getting answers whether people wanted to give them or not, so I stayed quiet, kept my eyes half closed, pretending the world was still spinning just enough that I couldn't focus, couldn't respond, couldn't be pulled into whatever this was, and for a second I thought he might leave, that he might turn around and walk away the same way the others had, like I was just another problem not worth solving, but instead there was a pause, a shift in the air, and then another voice, quieter but sharper, stepping closer, waiting, and then the first man spoke again, not to me this time but to someone behind him, someone I hadn't even realized was there. Bring her to me, and just like that everything changed, because those 4 words didn't sound like concern, they didn't sound like kindness. They sounded like a decision, final and absolute, the kind of decision that reshapes things whether you want it to or not, and before I could process it, before I could even think about what it meant, I felt movement around me, careful hands, controlled, not rough but not gentle either, lifting me just enough to make the world tilt, and I wanted to protest, to tell them to stop, to say I didn't need help, that I didn't belong to whatever this was. But the word stayed trapped somewhere between thought and breath, and all I could do was let it happen, let the moment carry me forward into something unknown, because even in that haze, even in that confusion, one thing settled into place with quiet certainty: the man who had given that order wasn't someone people ignored, and whatever he wanted, he got. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the kind that feels peaceful but the kind that feels controlled, like even the air knew better than to move without permission, and when I opened my eyes fully this time the world had changed from cracked pavement and flickering streetlights to something soft and dimly lit, the ceiling above me smooth and white, too clean to belong to anywhere I had ever been before, and for a second I thought maybe I had blacked out completely and imagined everything, but then I felt it, the weight of a blanket tucked carefully around me, the faint scent of something sterile mixed with something expensive, and the distant sound of a door closing somewhere far away, precise and quiet, like even the noise had been trained, and that was when panic finally caught up to me, sharp and sudden, cutting through the fog in my head as I pushed myself up too quickly, my body protesting in ways I refused to acknowledge. Because none of that mattered as much as one simple question: where am I? The words coming out weaker than I intended but still real, still mine, and for a moment there was no answer, just the steady ticking of something electronic and the faint hum of a building that felt too large to understand all at once, until a voice responded from somewhere to my left, calm, composed, and far too close: "You are safe." And I turned my head fast enough to make the room tilt slightly, my vision catching up just in time to see him standing there like he had always been part of the space, like the room had been built around him instead of the other way around. Alexander Romano, though I did not know his name yet, only the way he carried himself, straight, still, controlled, dressed in dark fabric that fit too perfectly to be accidental, his eyes fixed on me with a focus that felt less like concern and more like calculation, and something about that made my chest tighten again, because men like him did not just help people, they chose, they decided, and I had no idea why I had been chosen. I did not ask for this, I said, the words coming out stronger now, steadier, because if there was one thing I still had it was the ability to draw a line, even if I was not sure it would hold, and for a second nothing changed in his expression, not surprise, not annoyance, nothing at all, just that same quiet observation, like he was listening to more than what I said, like he was measuring something. Underneath it, before he stepped closer, not enough to invade, but enough to make it clear that distance existed because he allowed it to, not because I demanded it. You did not ask, he agreed, his voice even, almost neutral, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested the conversation was already moving in a direction I had not agreed to, but you were not left there either, and I swallowed. Because that was true, because whatever had happened before, whatever had led to me waking up here instead of somewhere worse, it had started with him, with that single command spoken like a fact, bring her to me, and I hated how much that mattered, how much it changed things I did not want changed. I can leave, I said quickly, pushing the blanket aside as if proving it would make it real. I am fine, I just need to go home, and for the first time something shifted in his gaze, not emotion exactly, but attention sharpened, focused in a way that made the room feel smaller, like the walls had leaned in just slightly to hear what he would say next. Home, he repeated, as if testing the word, weighing it, and then after a pause that lasted just long enough to make my pulse pick up again, he shook his head once, small, controlled, not dismissive but final, no, and that single word landed heavier than anything else, not raised, not forced, just stated with the kind of certainty that made arguing feel almost irrelevant, because in that moment I understood something I had not wanted to understand before. I had not been brought here to be asked what I wanted. I had been brought here because he had already decided what would happen next. The word no did not echo, it settled, heavy and immovable, like it belonged in the room more than I did, and for a moment I just stared at him, trying to decide if this was the part where I argued or the part where I pretended to agree until I could find a way out, but something in the way he stood there made it clear that neither option would change anything, because this was not a negotiation. It was a boundary I had not been asked to accept, and the realization tightened something in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with control, or the lack of it. You cannot keep me here, I said, forcing the words out evenly, carefully, like if I kept my voice steady it would make them stronger, more real, and for a second the silence stretched again, that same controlled stillness pressing in around us, until he tilted his head just slightly, not confused, not surprised, just considering, as if my statement had been expected, as if it had already been accounted for before I even spoke it. I am not keeping you, he said, and there was something precise in the way he chose those words, something deliberate. You are here because it is where you need to be, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny but because it was absurd, because people like me did not end up in places like this by need. We ended up here because someone else decided it, just like everything else. I need to go home, I repeated, more quietly this time, not because I was backing down but because something in me understood that raising my voice would not make a difference. And for the first time his gaze shifted, not away from me but through me, like he was looking past the words and into whatever was underneath them, and when he spoke again his voice had changed just enough to make me notice, still calm, still controlled, but sharper now, more focused. Home is not safe for you. The statement landed differently than the word no had, not heavier, but deeper, like it reached somewhere I had been trying not to think about, and I felt my fingers tighten against the edge of the blanket without meaning to, because I knew what he was referring to. Even if he had not said it directly, even if he had not needed to, you do not know that, I said quickly, the words coming faster than before, defensive, automatic, because admitting he might be right felt like giving something up that I could not afford to lose. But he did not respond right away, did not argue, did not push. He just watched me for a moment longer, and then he turned his head slightly toward the door. A small movement that should not have meant anything but somehow did, as if that single gesture carried weight beyond what I could see. Find him, he said, not to me, not even loudly, just enough for someone outside the room to hear, and I froze, because I knew, without needing it explained, exactly who he meant, and that realization sent something cold and sharp through the confusion in my head. You cannot do that, I said, my voice lower now, not because I wanted it to be but because something in the situation demanded it, because this was no longer just about me. Leaving or staying, it was about something else entirely, something bigger, something I had no control over, and for the first time since I had opened my eyes in this room. His attention sharpened in a way that felt almost personal, not emotional, but intentional, like I had just crossed into a space he cared about enough to respond to directly. "I already have," he said, and there was no hesitation, no doubt, just certainty, and that was when I understood the difference between us. I was still reacting, still trying to catch up to what was happening, and he was already 3 steps ahead, already moving pieces I could not see, already deciding outcomes I had not even realized were possible, and as much as I wanted to reject it, to push back, to find some way to take control of the situation, a quiet, unwelcome thought settled into place: whatever happened next was not going to be something I could stop. The air in the room felt different after that, not heavier, not lighter, just changed in a way I could not quite explain, like something had been set in motion and there was no way to pull it back, and I sat there watching him, trying to understand how someone could speak so calmly about things that felt anything but calm, how he could stand there like nothing in the world moved faster than his decisions. And for the first time I realized it was not confidence, it was certainty, the kind that comes from never being wrong about what you control. "You should not have done that," I said quietly, because the words needed to exist even if they did not matter, because if I did not say them it would feel like I was agreeing, like I was accepting something I did not understand. And he did not respond immediately, did not argue, did not defend himself. He just walked a few steps closer, slow, deliberate, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, close enough to remind me he could come closer if he wanted, far enough to show that he was choosing not to. "You think this is about him," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, just observation, but the way he said it made my stomach tighten, because I knew he was right. I knew I had been focusing on the wrong thing, on the person instead of the situation, on what had already happened instead of what could happen next, and I hated that he saw that so clearly. "It is about me leaving," I answered, forcing the words out before he could twist them into something else, before he could make this about something I did not want to face, but he shook his head slightly, that same controlled movement, precise and final. "No," he said again, softer this time but somehow more certain, "it is about you staying alive," and the words did not hit like an argument, they settled like a fact, quiet and steady and impossible to ignore, and for a moment I had nothing to say. Nothing to push back with, because deep down I knew there was truth in what he was saying, even if I did not want to admit it, even if I did not want him to be the one who said it. The door behind him opened just slightly then, not enough to break the moment but enough to remind me we were not alone in this, that there were other people moving, listening, waiting for his direction, and a man stepped in just far enough to be seen. His posture straight, his expression unreadable, a silent question in the way he paused, and Alexander did not even look at him right away, did not break eye contact with me as he spoke. "Keep her here," he said, his voice even, controlled, as if he was assigning something routine, not something that would change the course of my life completely, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because those 3 words sounded different than the others, not like a decision that could be debated, but like an instruction that would be followed without hesitation. "I am not staying," I said quickly, the resistance rising again before it could be pushed down, before it could be replaced with something more dangerous like acceptance, and this time he did look away, just for a second, toward the man at the door, a small nod that ended the exchange before it even began, and then his attention returned to me, steady, focused, unshaken. "You can walk out of that door," he said, gesturing slightly toward the hallway beyond, and for a split-second hope sparked, sharp and unexpected, because that was not what I had expected him to say, not after everything else, not after the way he had controlled every moment since I woke up, but then he continued. His voice unchanged, calm, certain, "And you will not make it 10 minutes before someone finds you," and just like that the hope disappeared, replaced by something colder, something heavier, because I believed him, not because I wanted to, but because everything about him suggested he did not say things unless they were true, and I sat there in silence, staring at him, trying to find a way around the reality he had just placed in front of me, trying to find a version of this where I still had control, and for the first time since this started, I could not see one, and that scared me more than anything else. Silence stretched between us after his words settled, not empty but filled with something unspoken, something that pressed against my chest and made it harder to breathe, because for the first time since I woke up in that room I was not reacting, I was thinking, and that was worse, because thinking meant acknowledging the possibility that he was right, that whatever waited outside those doors was not something I could outrun or outsmart. And I hated that the safest place I could imagine right now was the one I had not chosen. "You are assuming I need your protection," I said finally, my voice quieter but steadier, because if I was going to stand here I needed something to hold on to, some version of control that still belonged to me, and he did not interrupt, did not correct me immediately, he just listened, the way someone listens when they already know how the conversation ends. "I have handled things before," I continued, even though the words felt thinner the moment they left my mouth, even though part of me knew he would see right through them, because he had already seen through everything else, and sure enough, his expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened again, not dismissive, not cruel, just certain. "Handling things is not the same as being safe," he said, and I felt the truth in that land somewhere deeper than I wanted it to, because he was not talking about the surface, not about what I had managed to get through before, he was talking about what I had barely survived without realizing it, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else he had said. "I can call someone," I said quickly, reaching for another option, another way out, because there had to be one, there always was. "I have people," and even as I said it I realized how weak it sounded in this room, in this place where everything felt controlled down to the smallest detail, where even the silence seemed to follow his lead, and for a brief second something almost like curiosity crossed his face. "Not about me, but about the idea itself." "People," he repeated. And the way he said it made it clear he was not impressed. "Then call them," he added, stepping slightly to the side as if giving me space, as if offering me exactly what I had asked for, and for a moment I hesitated, because it felt too easy, too simple, like a test I had not agreed to take, but I reached anyway, my hand finding my pocket, my fingers brushing against nothing, and the realization hit me instantly. Sharp and immediate. My phone was gone, my bag, everything, left somewhere I could not get to, and I froze, the weight of that sinking in all at once, because that had been my last thread, my last connection to anything outside this place, and now it was gone, and I hated that he had known that would happen, hated that he had let me reach for it anyway, just to see, just to understand. "It will be returned to you," he said calmly, as if reading the exact moment the realization settled. "Once it is no longer a risk," and I looked up at him then, really looked this time, not just at the way he stood or the way he spoke, but at the space around him, at how everything seemed to align with him without effort, how even the uncertainty in my own mind felt like something he had already accounted for, and for the first time the fear shifted, not gone, not replaced, but redirected, because it was no longer just about what might happen outside those doors, it was about him. About the man who had stepped into a moment he did not have to and turned it into something I could not walk away from. "Why?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out quieter than I intended, not demanding, not defensive, just real, because none of this made sense without an answer, and for the first time since this began, he did not respond right away, did not fill the silence with certainty, he just watched me, and in that pause there was something different, something I could not quite name, before he finally spoke, his voice lower now, more deliberate, because someone needed to, and that answer did not explain anything, but somehow it made everything feel more complicated than before. His answer did not settle anything, it shifted something instead, like a piece of the ground beneath me had moved just enough to throw off my balance, and I sat there replaying it in my head, because someone needed to was not a reason, it was a decision, the kind people like him made without asking for permission, without needing to explain, and that made it harder to push back, harder to argue, because there was nothing concrete to argue against, just a reality I had been pulled into without warning. "You do not even know me," I said after a moment, the words quieter now, not sharp like before, just honest, because that was the part one could not understand. Why him, why me, why any of this? And for the first time his gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, like he was considering something beyond the surface of the conversation. "I know enough," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything, just a calm certainty that made the statement feel heavier than it should have been, and I shook my head before I could stop myself, because that answer was not enough, it could not be enough, enough to bring someone here, enough to change everything, enough to decide what happened next. "That is not how this works," I said, my voice gaining a little strength again, because if I let that stand it meant accepting his version of reality, and I was not ready to do that. You cannot just step into someone's life and decide what they need, and for a second the room went quiet again, that same controlled silence settling around us, but this time it felt different, less distant, more focused, like the moment mattered in a way the others had not, and he took another step closer. Not threatening, not aggressive, just enough to close the space between us slightly, enough that I could feel the shift in presence, the way everything seemed to center around him without effort, and when he spoke again his voice was lower, more deliberate, not louder but more precise. I did not step into your life, he said, his eyes holding mine in a way that made it impossible to look away. You were already in a situation that was going to end one way, and I changed it, and something about the way he said it made my chest tighten, because it did not sound like a claim, it sounded like a fact, like something he had already calculated, already seen play out in a version where he had not intervened, and I hated that part of me believed him, hated that part of me could picture it too clearly, the version of the night that did not end here, in this room, with this conversation. What makes you think you get to decide that? I asked, softer now, because the anger had nowhere solid to land, because the question felt less like defiance and more like something I genuinely needed to understand, and for a brief second something shifted in his expression again, not enough to call it emotion, but enough to notice, enough to make me pause, before he answered, because I was there, he said simply, and the words should not have carried as much weight as they did, but they did, because they stripped everything else away, all the assumptions, all the arguments, all the resistance, and left just that one point. He had been there, and now I was here, and there was no version of events where that was not connected, and the realization settled in slowly, not all at once, but enough to change the way I looked at him, not as a stranger who had taken control, but as someone who had stepped into a moment I could not undo, and reshaped it in a way I did not yet understand, and that was when I realized something else. Something quieter but just as important. He was not asking me to trust him, he was asking me to accept that the choice had already been made, and whether I agreed with it or not did not change the fact that I was still here. For a long moment I said nothing, because there was nothing left to argue without repeating myself, and repeating myself would only prove what he already believed, that I was still trying to fight something that had already moved past the point of negotiation, and I hated that realization more than anything else, not because I wanted to be right, but because being wrong meant I was standing in a situation I could not control, and that was something I had always avoided, something I had built my life around avoiding. You talk like everything is already decided, I said finally, my voice quieter now, not sharp, not defensive, just tired in a way I had not allowed myself to feel until this moment, and for the first time since I woke up, the words did not feel like resistance, they felt like observation, like I was finally seeing the situation for what it was instead of what I wanted it to be. And he did not deny it, did not soften it, he simply held my gaze, steady, unshaken, because it is, he answered, and the simplicity of that response should have frustrated me, should have pushed me back into anger, but it did not, it just settled there, heavy and quiet, because part of me already knew it was true, part of me had known it the second I heard him give that first order, the second everything shifted without asking for my permission. Then what happens to me, I asked, and this time the question was not a challenge. It was real, because if I could not change the situation, I needed to understand it, needed something to hold on to that was not uncertainty, and for a moment he did not answer, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how to say it, and that alone told me more than the words would. You stay here, he said eventually, his voice calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something quieter, something that almost sounded like intention rather than command. Until it is handled, and I frowned slightly, because that word carried too many meanings, too many possibilities. Handled how? I asked, and this time he did not hesitate. The person who put you in that position will not have the chance to do it again, and the way he said it sent a small, sharp chill through me, not because of what it implied, but because of how certain he sounded, how final it felt, like whatever he had set in motion was already too far along to be stopped, and I looked down for a second, my fingers tightening slightly against the fabric beneath me, because that was not something I had asked for, not something I had wanted, but it was something that had already been decided without me. You keep deciding things for me, I said quietly. And when I looked back up at him there was no accusation left in my voice, just a statement, because that was what it was, a pattern I could not ignore anymore, and for the first time since this began, he did not answer immediately, did not fill the silence with certainty. He just watched me, and something in that moment shifted again, subtle but real, like the space between us was no longer just about control, but about something else neither of us had fully acknowledged yet. I decide what keeps you safe, he said finally, and the words should have felt the same as everything else he had said, controlled, absolute, final, but they did not, because this time there was something different in the way he said it, something that made it feel less like a rule and more like a boundary he had drawn around me, something I had not asked for but could not ignore, and I swallowed slowly, because that was the part that unsettled me the most. Not the control, not the certainty, but the fact that for the first time since this started, I was not sure if I wanted to walk away from it as much as I thought I did. The shift in my own thoughts unsettled me more than anything he had said, because it was not supposed to happen like that, it was not supposed to feel different, not supposed to feel like something I could lean toward instead of away from, and I forced myself to look at him again, really look this time, as if seeing him clearly would fix whatever had just changed inside me, but it did not, it only made it worse, because there was nothing exaggerated about him, nothing dramatic, just quiet control, quiet certainty, and that made it harder to reject, harder to dismiss as something I could walk away from without consequence. You make it sound simple, I said, my voice softer now, not because I was giving in but because something in me had stopped pushing as hard, as if resistance itself had started to feel exhausting, and for a moment he did not respond, just watched me the same way he had from the beginning, like he was waiting for something more. Something beneath the surface words. Before he spoke again, "It is simple," he said. And there was no emphasis, no force, just that same steady tone that made everything he said feel like it had already been decided long before I questioned it. You stay where you are safe, and I exhaled slowly, because that word again, safe, it kept coming back like a fixed point in a situation that felt anything but stable, and I did not know if I believed it yet, did not know if I trusted what he defined as safety. But I could not ignore the fact that I was here instead of somewhere else. Somewhere worse, and that mattered more than I wanted it to. For how long, I asked, because if this was something I could not change, then I needed to understand its limits, needed to find the edges of it, and for the first time there was a slight pause in his answer, not uncertainty, just calculation, as if he was measuring time in a way I could not see. Until it is finished, he said. And the lack of detail in that answer should have frustrated me, should have pushed me back into questioning everything, but instead it made me focus on something else, something quieter. What if I do not agree? I asked, and this time the question was not sharp, not defensive, it was honest, because that was the part that still mattered, whether I had a say in any of this at all, and he held my gaze for a long second before answering, his expression unchanged but his attention sharper. Then you leave, he said simply. And the words landed differently this time, not like an option, but like a test. Because we both knew what came after that, we both knew what he had already said about what would happen if I walked out that door, and I swallowed. Because for the first time the choice felt real, not because it was fair, but because it existed, even if it was weighted in a way I could not ignore, and I looked away for a second, my eyes drifting toward the doorway, toward the quiet hallway beyond, trying to imagine it, trying to picture myself standing up and walking out, reclaiming something that felt like mine, but the image did not hold, it fractured too quickly, replaced by the memory of what he had said, 10 minutes, and the certainty in his voice when he said it, and when I looked back at him he had not moved, not even slightly, still standing exactly where he had been, still watching, still waiting, not for me to agree, but for me to understand, and that was the difference. He was not asking for permission, he was giving me the space to see what he already knew, and something in that realization settled quietly into place, not acceptance, not yet, but something close enough to it that I could not ignore it anymore, and for the first time since I woke up in that room, I did not argue, I did not push back, I just sat there in the silence between us and realized that the hardest part was not that he had taken control of the situation, it was that part of me was starting to believe he was right. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore, it felt like a space I had stepped into willingly, even if I had not admitted it out loud, and that realization sat quietly in the back of my mind as I watched him, as I let the weight of everything settle without immediately pushing against it, because pushing had not changed anything, it had only delayed the moment I understood what was actually happening. And now that moment had arrived whether I was ready for it or not, you planned all of this, I said after a while, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating what had become obvious in a way I could not ignore anymore, and he did not deny it, did not pretend otherwise, he simply met my gaze with that same steady calm that had been there from the beginning. I prepared for possibilities, he replied, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not something unusual for him, not something out of the ordinary, just another situation accounted for before it happened, and I let out a slow breath, because that explained more than I expected it to. It explained how he could stand there without hesitation, without doubt, how he could move through everything like it had already been decided, because in his world, it probably had. Does that include me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it, because if everything else had been anticipated, then where did that leave me? Was I just another variable, another outcome he had already calculated? And for the first time since I had been in this room, there was a pause that felt different, not longer, not heavier, just more deliberate, as if the answer mattered in a way the others had not. No, he said finally, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard. Because I had expected something more complicated, something colder, something that would place me exactly where I feared I was. Then why me? I pressed, the words coming faster now, not out of resistance but out of something closer to confusion, because none of this made sense without a reason, without something that connected him to me beyond that moment in the street. And this time he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, not away, but inward again, like he was considering how much to say, how much to reveal, before he stepped a little closer, closing the distance just enough to change the dynamic between us, enough that I could feel the presence of him more clearly, not threatening, just undeniable. Because you did not walk away, he said, and the answer made me frown, because it did not fit, not at first. What does that mean? I asked, and there was something in my voice now that had not been there before, something softer, something that was not trying to fight him but understand him. And he held my gaze for a moment before continuing, most people in your position do not stay still, they run, they panic, they make choices that make everything worse, but you did not. And something in his tone shifted slightly, not enough to call it approval, but enough to feel like recognition. And I blinked, caught off guard by that, because I had not thought of it that way, had not considered that doing nothing had been a choice at all. I did not have a choice, I said quietly, because that was how it had felt, like there had been no good options, no clear path forward, just a moment I had survived the only way I could. And he shook his head slightly. That same controlled movement that seemed to carry more meaning than it should. You always have a choice, he said. And the certainty in his voice made something shift again, because he believed that, not as a concept, but as a fact. And I sat there, absorbing that, replaying the moment in my head in a way I had not before, not as something that had happened to me, but as something I had moved through, something I had chosen, even if it had not felt like it at the time. And when I looked back at him, something in my expression must have changed. Because for the first time since this started, his gaze softened just slightly, not enough to lose its edge, but enough to show that he saw it, saw the shift in me, and acknowledged it without saying a word. And that was when I realized the truth I had been avoiding. This was no longer just about being kept here, it was about why I was still here, and for the first time, I was not entirely sure the answer was only him. Something in the room felt quieter after that, not because the silence had changed, but because I had, because the way I was sitting there now was different than before, less tense, less ready to push back against every word he said. And I did not like that realization, did not like how easily the shift had happened without me noticing. As if somewhere along the way I had stopped fighting just long enough for everything to settle into place around me. And I looked at him again, searching for something that would pull me back into certainty, into resistance. But all I found was the same steady presence, the same quiet control that had been there from the beginning. You make it sound like I chose this, I said, my voice low, not accusing, just trying to understand where he was drawing that line. And for a moment he did not respond, just studied me like he had been doing all along, as if the answer mattered less than what I did with it. Before he finally spoke, you chose how you responded, he said, and the distinction in his words caught my attention immediately, because it shifted the focus again, away from what had happened and onto what I had done in that moment. And I exhaled slowly, thinking about it in a way I had not allowed myself to before, not as something I survived, but as something I moved through, something I influenced. even if only slightly, and that realization was uncomfortable in a way I could not ignore, because it meant I had more control than I thought, and less than I wanted, both at the same time, and I glanced toward the doorway again, not because I was planning to leave, but because it had become a reference point. A reminder of the choice that still existed even if it was not a good one, and when I looked back at him he was still watching, still waiting, not impatient, not pushing, just present in a way that made it impossible to forget he was the one holding everything together. What happens when it is finished? I asked, because that was the part that still felt unclear, the part that would define everything that came after this moment, and for the first time since this began, his answer did not come immediately, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how much to give me, how much to let me see ahead of time, and that hesitation told me more than the words would. You go back to your life, he said finally, and the answer should have felt simple, reassuring even, but it did not, because it sounded too distant, too clean, like something that existed on the other side of everything that was happening now, and I frowned slightly, because there was something missing from it, something he was not saying. Back to what it was before, I pressed, and this time his gaze shifted. Just slightly, enough to show that the question had landed exactly where I intended it to, and for a second the silence stretched again, not empty, but deliberate, before he answered. That depends, he said, and the two words carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because they opened something instead of closing it. They suggested that whatever came next was not fixed, not entirely decided, and that unsettled me more than certainty ever could. Depends on what? I asked, my voice quieter now, almost careful, because I was not sure I wanted the answer as much as I needed it. And when he looked at me this time there was something different in his expression. Something sharper, more focused, like the conversation had shifted into something deeper without either of us saying it out loud. On whether you still need protection, he said, and the words should not have changed anything, but they did, because they were no longer just about the situation, they were about me, about what I chose to accept, what I chose to walk away from, and I felt something tighten in my chest again, not fear, not exactly, something more complicated, because for the first time since this started, the future was not just something he controlled, it was something that somehow involved me too, and I was not sure if that made things better or worse. His words stayed with me longer than I expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise, because they left space for something I had not considered before, the idea that this was not just temporary, not just something I would walk away from unchanged, and I shifted slightly where I sat, becoming more aware of the room around me, the quiet, the control, the fact that nothing here felt accidental. And that included me. You keep saying protection like it is something I will need again, I said, my voice steady but lower now, because the question mattered more than the answer this time, and he did not dismiss it, did not brush it aside like the others. He simply looked at me for a moment, as if deciding how much I was ready to understand, before he spoke. It is not about need, he said, and there was something different in his tone, something more deliberate. It is about what has already started. And the words settled slowly, because they suggested something ongoing. Something that had not ended. When I was brought here, something that existed outside this room whether I acknowledged it or not, and I felt a slight tension return to my chest, not sharp, but present. What does that mean? I asked, and this time I did not try to hide the question, did not try to make it sound like anything other than what it was, uncertainty, and for a second he said nothing, then he moved, not abruptly, not in a way that startled, just a quiet shift as he walked toward the window at the far side of the room, his movements controlled, measured, like everything else about him, and when he stopped he did not turn around immediately, he just stood there, looking out into something I could not see from where I was. People notice patterns, he said after a moment, his voice carrying across the room without needing to be raised. They notice when something changes, when something does not follow the outcome they expected, and I frowned slightly, because I could feel where this was going but I did not want to assume, and when he turned back toward me his expression had not changed, but his attention had sharpened again. You were part of a situation that was supposed to end differently, he continued, and there was no emotion in the statement, just fact, and that made it harder to ignore, harder to dismiss as something exaggerated or distant, and I swallowed, because that meant whatever had happened was not isolated, not contained, it was something that extended beyond that moment, beyond me. So now what? I asked quietly, and for the first time there was no hesitation in his answer. Now they look for what changed, he said, and the simplicity of it made it more unsettling, because it did not leave room for misunderstanding, did not soften the reality of it, and I sat there processing that, feeling the weight of it settle into place piece by piece, because if someone was looking, if something had shifted, then this was not over, not even close, and I looked at him again, searching for something that would tell me how serious it was, how far it would go, but all I found was that same calm certainty, that same control that made everything feel already decided. You are saying I am part of that change, I said, and this time it was not a question, just a realization spoken out loud, and he nodded once, small, precise, confirming it without needing to explain further, and something in me went still again, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because that meant leaving was not just about walking away, it was about stepping back into something unfinished, something unresolved, something that might not leave me alone just because I wanted it to, and for a moment I did not say anything, did not argue, did not push back, I just sat there with the weight of it, and when I finally spoke my voice was quieter than before, not weak, just certain in a different way. So staying here changes that, and this time his answer came without delay, yes, and there was no elaboration, no explanation, just that single word, steady and final, and for the first time since this began, I understood the full shape of the choice in front of me, not as something he had forced on me, but as something that existed whether I accepted it or not, and that realization made everything feel sharper, clearer, and somehow more complicated all at once. The word yes did not leave room for interpretation, it settled into the space between us like something solid, something that could not be moved just by wanting it to be different, and I sat there letting it sink in, not resisting it this time, not immediately trying to find a way around it, because for the first time I understood the shape of what he was offering, not control, not ownership, but something more complicated, something that came with conditions whether I liked it or not, and I exhaled slowly, my gaze dropping for a second before returning to him, because avoiding it would not change anything, it would only delay what I already knew, so if I stay, I said carefully, choosing the words with more thought than before, because now they mattered, then what happens, and he did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because he was deciding how much to say, how much I was ready to hear, and that pause stretched just long enough to make me aware of how different everything felt compared to when I first woke up. Less chaotic, less reactive, more focused, like I had stepped into the same pace he had been moving at from the beginning. You are not involved, he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something more deliberate, something that sounded less like instruction and more like a boundary, and I frowned slightly, because the answer felt incomplete. What does that mean? I asked, and this time I did not try to hide the uncertainty in my voice, because pretending to understand would not help me here, it would only make things worse, and he held my gaze for a moment before continuing. It means you stay out of it, he said, and the clarity of his words made it easier to grasp, easier to understand exactly where I stood, and yet it also made something else rise up in me, something I had not expected, something that felt uncomfortably close to frustration. You make decisions. You change things, and I am just supposed to sit here and do nothing, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended, not because I was angry, but because I was realizing what that actually meant, and for the first time since this began, there was a slight shift in his expression, not irritation, not surprise, just awareness, like he had been waiting for that question, waiting for me to reach that point on my own. Doing nothing is not the same as being powerless, he said. And the way he said it made me pause, because it reframed something I had been holding onto since the beginning, something I had not questioned until now, and I leaned back slightly, my thoughts catching up to his words, because if I was not powerless, then what was I? Where did that leave me in all of this? Then what am I doing here? I asked, quieter now, not pushing, just trying to understand the role I had been placed into without choosing it, and he took a step closer, just enough to close the space between us again. Enough to make the moment feel more direct, more intentional. You are staying where you cannot be reached, he said, and the simplicity of it should have ended the conversation, but it did not, because there was something else in the way he said it, something that made it feel less like a strategy and more like a decision he had made specifically about me, and I felt my breath slow slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because I was starting to see the difference, starting to understand that this was not just about the situation anymore, it was about the way he had chosen to handle it, and the way that choice now included me, even if I had not agreed to it. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence settling in again, but this time it felt different, not tense, not uncertain, just quiet, like something had shifted into place without needing to be forced, and I realized something then, something I had been avoiding since the beginning. This was no longer just about getting out, it was about what happened if I stayed, and for the first time, I was not sure which option felt more real. The realization settled slowly, not all at once, but in pieces that fit together whether I wanted them to or not, and I sat there feeling the weight of it without pushing it away this time, because pushing had not worked, resisting had not changed anything, and for the first time since all of this began I allowed myself to just exist in the moment without trying to control what came next, and that alone felt unfamiliar, like stepping into something I did not fully understand but could not step out of anymore. "You are asking me to trust you," I said quietly, not as an accusation, not even as a question, just as a statement of what this had become, and he did not answer right away, did not confirm it or deny it. He simply watched me with that same steady attention, like he was waiting to see if I would understand it on my own, and after a moment I realized something. He had never actually asked for that. Not once, not directly, he had not told me to trust him, he had not tried to convince me, he had simply acted, made decisions, created a situation where trust was not the starting point but something that might come later, if it came at all. "You are not asking," I corrected myself, my voice softer now, more certain in a different way, "you are just doing what you think is right," and this time there was a slight shift in his expression, not enough to call it agreement, but enough to show I was not wrong, and for a moment the silence between us felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, just real, like we had reached a point where there was nothing left to pretend about, and I took a slow breath, my gaze drifting for a second before returning to him, because this was the moment, the one where I either stepped away or stepped into something I could not fully see yet, and for the first time I did not look toward the door, did not measure the distance, did not imagine leaving. Instead I stayed exactly where I was, and that choice felt louder than anything I could have said. "I am not agreeing with you," I said, the words clear, steady, because I needed that to be understood, needed to hold on to something that was still mine, and he nodded once, small, precise. Like that did not surprise him, like it had never been a requirement in the first place. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of that response made something in my chest ease slightly, because it meant this was not about forcing agreement, it was about something else entirely, something I was only beginning to understand. "But I am not leaving either," I added, and this time the words felt heavier, more deliberate, because they were not just a reaction, they were a decision, one I could not undo once I made it. And for a moment he said nothing, just held my gaze, and there was something different in the way he looked at me now, not softer, not weaker, but more focused, like he was seeing me as part of the situation instead of something placed into it, and that shift mattered more than I expected, more than I was ready to admit. "Then you stay," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a finality that did not feel forced, just acknowledged.